thank you all for staying here and listening to my talk. I want to talk about the question, do animals have a role in future food systems? And actually, I want to kick off with the question I asked myself many years ago when I started working in this field. Should I lower my consumption of animal-sourced food? Please raise your hand if you ever thought about this question the last couple of years. So, I hoped for this. I wasn't sure. Actually, it's a very timely question nowadays. And it's a question I discuss very often with my students, but also with stakeholders in the field. But it was a question that was really never discussed when I was a student. When I was a student, the focus was on increasing animal and farm productivity and producing more food. Here you see why. This is a picture of a protest, actually, of Dutch housewives. This protest that they were stating, we demand more meat. It was just after the Second World War, and parts of the Netherlands experienced severe hunger. And meat, and that was also stressed previously, is a highly nutrient-dense food product. So it's again this context that Sicko Mansholt, who was the former president of the European Commission, and his colleagues developed a plan, the Mansholt Plan, to modernize agriculture. And this plan was focusing on producing more animal-sourced food to alleviate hunger. And that plan actually was very, very successful, because in 30 years, milk production increased with 50%, pork and egg production doubled, and chicken production even increased fourfold. But we now also know, and that has been stressed already, that food production, and especially the production of animal-sourced food, has also an impact on our planet. Globally, food production is responsible for 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions, 1/3 of the terrestrial acidification, and 80% of the eutrophication of water. And the contribution of livestock is significant. Adrian Leib computed what the contribution of livestock is to the environmental impact of the food system. That's what's given here. Livestock in Europe occupy about 65% of all the agricultural land, and they are responsible for 70% of all the water emissions from the food system. And they are responsible for 80% of the loss of biodiversity, 80% of the air pollution, and 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So we know that all. And we want to take our responsibility. So people are more and more thinking about a healthy planet. And we realize more and more that a healthy planet actually is the ultimate boundary of our life. We need a healthy planet to develop societies and to have economies flourish. So that's the ultimate boundary of sustainability. And I'm showing this picture because many years ago, when people were talking about profit, planet, and people, the 3 pillars of sustainability, they thought that these were equally important. And now it's increasingly acknowledged in the field of sustainability that the planet is the ultimate boundary of sustainability. And that's also why I'm focusing so much on the planet in this talk now. And this environmental awareness in society actually changed the protests on the street from "we want more meat" to "you should go vegan to save the planet," in only 60 years. So how should we reduce the environmental impact of food production? And what role do animals have in an environmentally friendly diet? That's a question that a lot of people research. And actually, 98%, I would say, maybe even 99% of the studies that you find in the scientific literature use a product footprint approach. And in more technical terms, you could say an attributional life cycle assessment. And these studies either focus on how can I produce my product with less impact to the environment, or how can I eat differently? Which products should I eat to reduce the impact of my entire consumption? To start with, first, what is a product footprint? A product footprint actually is a method that quantifies the resource use, for example, the land use or the water use, throughout the entire production chain, so throughout the life cycle of a product, or the greenhouse gas emissions throughout the life cycle of a product, then we call it a carbon footprint. Here you see the example of the chicken chain. So to produce chicken meat, we need chicken broiler breeders, we need a hatchery, and we need broiler farms. And once the broilers are full grown, they are going to the slaughtery, to the retail, and there you can buy your product. To have all these animals in the broiler production system, you also need to import feed into the system. So feed is coming into the system and it's produced all over the world. But in addition to feed, also electricity or water or medicines is flowing into the system. So with a food product approach, you follow the resource use along the life cycle of the production of chicken meat. And processes that do not contribute to the production of meat basically are excluded from your analysis. So if the chicken eats grain and it's not using the straw as litter, it's excluded. Similarly, manure is excluded, or unhatched eggs or offals. That's good to remember. So here you see the 10 to 90 percentile range in product footprints that was very recently published by Joseph Poor and Thomas Nemesek in Science in June this year. And they made a very extensive review of product footprints based on 40,000 farms and 1,600 processors and retailers. So it's the most, well-known review. Here I give two examples, the land footprint and the greenhouse gas footprint. And what you, for example, see, the dotted line is the median, by the way, is that to produce 100 grams of protein from suckler beef, you either need 40 square meters up to 370 square meters, depending on the system, etc. There is a huge variation. So there is a huge variation in footprints within a product. That's one thing that you can see on this slide. The next thing, and then watch the difference in scale when you move down, which I illustrated with the dotted green line, is that there is a huge difference in product footprints across products. And then you basically see that chicken meat or eggs are favorable sources of animal source food. But you also see that plant source food has a very low footprint. And it's based on these kind of studies that people think, okay, if there is a huge variability in impact within a food product, I can produce more efficiently. Or if you see that plant source food has a lower impact, maybe we should eat plant source food. So, and there are many of these studies out there. So let's think in these two lines first. So those people that say you should produce with less impact, and I've heard this also during the discussion before, say we should increase herd productivity. So feed efficiency. If you need less feed for the same amount of product, you are more efficient. You need a higher growth rate or a higher reproductive rate, so increase herd productivity. But, and that was also stated previously, if you do so, you often also need a higher quality feed, because you cannot be an athlete without a very well diet. So you need a higher quality feed. And as a result of that, you see that you introduce often feed-food competition. So these studies tell you that we should move from grass-based ruminants to mixed ruminant systems where we also feed a bit of grain. Those studies that focus on eating with less impact tell you you should eat chicken instead of milk or beef. Whereas we know, and that's also illustrated by your protein conversion ratio, that chicken eat much more grain than ruminants do. So it's again an example of feed-food competition. And in the ultimate case, they even say you should go vegan, because that's best for the planet. You need the lowest amount of land if you eat only animal-sourced food. Papers in Nature Science say so. But what do you then do with all the co-products that are produced during the production of human food? Crop residues, co-products from food processing, maybe even food waste. And how do you value grass resources? Do we need them to feed the world? So in a paper, we showed that a footprint approach is actually not the right way to address feed-food competition and interlinkages in the food system. So actually, it's not the right way to answer the question, do animals have a role in future food systems? And to answer that question, you need a food systems approach. And from our food systems analysis, we learned the following thing. So if you have to feed the future population a healthy diet, and you want to do so while using your land and your natural water in the most efficient way, what should you do? It's very intuitive. You should use all your arable land to produce human food. And all the products, the byproducts, the biomass that's flowing out of that food production that humans cannot eat, like crop residues, co-products from the food system, but maybe even food waste, can be valued by animals. In addition, with the grass resources that are out there. So the role of animals in this system is to recycle biomass that humans cannot eat or do not want to eat back into the food system. Otherwise, these nutrients in these co-products, which I will call leftovers, and grass resources are lost for food production. And obviously, we cannot only use the land for food production, but also our waters. So we can also harvest seaweeds or fish, as we know already, to feed the human population. But the majority of my talk will be focused on livestock. We are working on the fish problem. Helene van Karnebeek, who is also sitting here in the audience, was actually the first PhD student working with me that also demonstrated that we use land most efficiently if we use animals only to unlock this biomass for humans, so to avoid feed-food competition. And she used food systems modeling to basically make this drawing. What she did is she determined the total amount of land that you need, which is on the y-axis, to feed a fixed population a diet varying in amount of animal-sourced food. And the amount of animal-sourced food is on the x-axis. On average, we need about 60 grams of protein, plant and animal protein, per person per day. So a value of 0 here implies that you eat all your protein, all your 60 grams from plants. So it's actually the vegan scenario. So this is a vegan diet. And moving up the x-axis means that you eat relatively more of your 60 grams of protein from animals. And what you then see, if you take a food systems approach, is that not the vegan diet is the best diet, which is what's stated by all the life cycle studies, but actually a diet with a small amount of animal source food gives you the lowest land use. And at this point, animals do recycle biomass inedible for humans back into the food system. Why do we need more land if you have a vegan diet? Well, those co-products from fruit processing and grass resources cannot be used by animals because animals are not in your diet. So you need an additional amount of crops to meet the requirements of the human population. So you need a bit more cropland. And this was actually I was very happy to find this result. Helene's conceptual model, however, was not able to answer the question, what is then the exact amount of animal source food that we should consume based on this land use efficiency? So therefore we started a review. So Hannah van Zandt and I reviewed the literature that was out there. There were a few studies, like the 2% that were left, that looked from this perspective to the role of animals. And based on those studies, we found a range from 9 to 23 grams of protein per person per day. And this is a huge range. So it's interesting to look at what are the causes of this range and what that tells us. So that's what we did. And actually, then we saw three things. It was mainly explained by the in or exclusion of food waste as livestock feed, the type of plant source food that you include in your diet, and the type of animals that were included in the studies. Let's walk through these factors to kind of understand what our potential range of consumption can be. The first one is to use food waste as livestock feed. The lowest value of 9 grams per protein per day that exclude food waste as livestock feed. And actually they base that on the fact that in Europe it's not allowed to use food waste as livestock feed because of disease risks like the foot and mouth disease, the classical swine fever, but also the mad cow disease. But actually in Asia, here is an example of Japan. I got the pictures from my friend Erasmus. He visited Japan, and there they are collecting already 35% of their food waste. Here you see the collection. They heat treat the food waste at 70 to 80 degrees to kill the virus. They determine the nutritional quality, and they feed the food waste only to pigs to avoid the mad cow disease. And actually, food waste is a very valuable food product for pigs. So it has a huge impact on this range, so it was very important. Of course, our first aim should be to reduce food waste, because that's best for the planet. But if we have it, we might learn from these examples in Japan and start using it again. The second factor that affected the range was actually the type of plant source foods included in the diet. And I'm using a bit of a typical example, the example of cooking oil, but the different studies also assumed that you need oil for cooking. Some of them said, okay, I will choose rapeseed oil, whereas others said, I use soybean oil. If you look at the product footprint as quantified by Poor and Nemesek, then choosing rapeseed oil would be the logical choice. Because to produce 1 liter of rapeseed oil, you need about 2.5 square meters of land. And to produce 1 liter of soybean oil, you'll need 11 square meters of land, so it's much more. But the co-product that comes with the production of oil, the soybean meal, has a much higher nutritional value for pigs than the rapeseed meal. So if you look at the entire package, so the food value of the product and the feed value of the product, then you see that overall this might be the better choice. Keep in mind that the oil was the driver of the production of soybeans in this example, which is not the case now. So this tells us that we have to design smart cropping systems. So when we think about using our arable land in the best way, we have to think smartly to choose our crops in such a way that the co-products are also very valuable as livestock feed. A third aspect that explains the differences among the studies was the type of animals that were chosen, but also the way that they fixed which resources could be used by what livestock species. So basically they assumed, one study for example, assumed that all the food waste and all the co-products were going to pigs, whereas others said, oh no, co-products can also go to cattle, so that was fixed. And that also affected the solution. And I think there is a lot to win to ask yourself the question, which leftovers and grass resources should be fed to what animals, and also to what animals with what productivity level? And not only to optimize the production of the food, but also to think about the value of the manure again. Because if animals have this role in a circular food system, also the manure of all these animals should be valued in that food system to feed the soil. And actually this is a question, this is a question that one of my students is actually working on, but the results were too preliminary, I thought, to present them here. So, from this review we learned that the amount of animal source food that we can consume in a sustainable way, in a way that's most efficient at least for your land use, is limited by the availability of biomass inedible or not wanted by humans, and the efficiency with which these biomass resources are transformed into food by animals. Let's have a look at what we are doing right now. Here you see on the x-axis first the percentage of the population living in a specific region of the world. And then you can see that more than half of our population actually is living in Asia. And on the x-axis, you see the amount of animal protein available for human consumption from livestock at this very moment. If we now plot the maximum value that Hannah found in her review, 23 grams of animal protein per person per day, then you basically see that the high-income countries are over-consuming and that there is still potential for growth in these other countries. You have to realize, though, that this value, this line, this threshold, I could say, is not yet set in stone. It's a first estimate. So you can think about all kinds of reasons why this threshold could increase. The studies we reviewed so far only acknowledged the protein provision of livestock, and we know that especially the micronutrient provision of livestock is very important, so that might increase the threshold, and we are interested in researching that. But also, if we are able to use our food waste and to collect it very effectively, then that might also give a bit more animal source foods, because the studies now only said you can include 10% of your food waste. But, on the other hand, you could also think of factors that can decrease this threshold. Because now the studies assume that all the biomass that's coming from the land and the water is used for food production, and we know that we are also using biomass for bioplastics or for clothing, etc. So, which part of the biomass can be spent on food production? And a last very important thing I would like to stress is that this perspective, this threshold that we computed, was computed from a land use perspective. And there is more than land use, even though that land use is very central to many environmental issues. So what's the threshold in terms of water use, fossil phosphorus use, or climate change? And which animals do play a role if you take that perspective, or biodiversity, for example? So there are many more issues. And actually, Helene was going to present on Wednesday morning also looked at this question from the perspective of efficient use of fossil phosphorus, because, well, we know that we are using phosphate rock as a source for phosphorus fertilization, and that this source is limited. So we don't want to deplete that. So do we also have a curve with a dip? So is there also an optimal amount of animal source food if we take the perspective of the fossil phosphorus story? And the answer was yes, but only if we recycle the phosphorus in human excreta. Because if we don't do that, then it was best to eat only plant source food. And the reason is because animal source food has a relatively high level of phosphorus, and if we don't recycle the excreta from human food systems, there is the leakage in the system. But I think we should do that anyhow, to kind of make sure that we use our phosphorus ultimately efficiently in the end. So yes, from a phosphorus perspective, we saw the same pattern. And also from a water perspective, we see the same pattern. But what about emissions and greenhouse gas emissions? The studies that we reviewed showed that if you eat a moderate amount of animal source food from animals as recyclers, that indeed your emissions will reduce. But they have not shown that that's better than a plant source food. And that's actually a question of Hannah for her future research. And so I don't know exactly where that point will be. And that will also very much depend on the role of ruminants, as stated by you. These two aspects, biodiversity and animal welfare, I think are relatively good to align with eating a moderate amount of animal source food and using animals as recyclers. Because if we do that, we use land in the most efficient way, so we don't need additional land for food production. We avoid as much as we can deforestation and land use change, so that's good. And also, if we do so, then animals should be used to utilize this biomass that we cannot eat, and that efficiency should be optimized, which is not the same as the highest animal productivity per year. So it might be that the total productivity of the animal is a bit lower, but the food system has a higher performance, and that also opens up doors for nature-inclusive agriculture and producing with respect for the welfare of the animals. So this is what I'm basically saying. We should use animals to recycle biomass into the food system and value those nutrients that otherwise would have been lost in terms of food production, manure, but of course also ecosystem services, but I can't address everything here. So does this say that I believe that we should go back to the situation before the World War, before Mansell's plan to modernize agriculture? But actually, that was what animals were doing at those times. And also in the majority of the developing world, this is what animals are doing. I think we should not go back to the past. We should combine these ecological principles of circularity with technological innovations to get the best out of the two worlds and to produce animal source food for our future population. And I also think we can't, because due to globalization and specialization, the scales at which we have to interact with the different elements of the food system, so the animals, the plants, the food waste, the humans, that scale is at a higher level than before. So we can't go back to the future. So to conclude, yes, animals have a role in future food systems, in my opinion. So that's good news for us. We might stay in business. But I think we should also rethink the way that, especially in Europe, animals are used. So we should rethink and avoid feed-food competition and breed and feed and house the animals in such a way that they utilize those biomass streams that we cannot eat or do not want to eat in the most efficient way. And that also goes with consuming maybe a bit less animal source food in high-income countries to allow also an increase in other areas of the world. Where exactly that point should be, so what is now the optimal amount of animal source food in the diet? I think that that answer requires more systems research, so I can't really say that. So that keeps me busy for the coming period. And with this, I would like to thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much for this excellent talk. We are a bit behind time schedule, I know this, and you talk too much about food and food waste and running away, but we have the time, we take the time for 2 questions. There's one in the back and one in the front.
Yeah.
We start in the front and you have the mic first.
Okay, thank you. It was a very inspiring talk. Every researcher wants to have an impact on society. We don't want our studies to be locked in cabinets and things like that, so we want to have a real impact on society. So your message is to change also our food habits and consume less meat or animal products. And it seems, Jaak, your work is being very highly valued and honored by this association, by the Eaap. So I wonder, should we in the next conferences, and it's going to be in Belgium and I'm going to play a small part in that, should we then have a vegan diet to compensate for the overconsumption of meat on this conference?
I leave that to the organizers of the conference, I think. Well, I think it's at least good that we think about it. And that was actually my main message. And in this respect, I would give a personal answer. When I started my studies, I wasn't really thinking about consuming less animal source food. And nowadays I do, and I still consume animal source food, but not every day. And if I pick the choice, I try to pick a product produced with respect for the animals. And if everybody would do that, that would help, and also at the conference, I think.
Thank you, Imke. There was one more in the back.
Yes?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I was wondering, you mentioned that in Europe we should rethink...
Can you raise your hand?
Yes,
oh, yeah,
sorry.
sorry. Yeah.
You mentioned that in Europe we should rethink the way we use animals, for example, for the use of food waste and so on. But you also mentioned the fact that for health reasons and so on, we don't do it here, which is more of a political decision. So we as scientists, we might understand why it would be useful and that we could limit the risks, but how do you think there's really a possibility when it comes to convincing consumers and politicians to reverse this, so to say?
Yeah, actually I think it's already happening because at the moment processed animal proteins, that's one of the problems, can be used again for fish. And the regulation about pigs is going to be poultry is going to be changed, I think, this year. The only thing that you cannot do is feed poultry waste to poultry. So I think the perception on this is really changing. And of course, we should do that while avoiding having these disease risks and having the mad cow disease. But this is also why I'm showing the example in Japan, where they are already doing this for many years. So my suggestion would be go there, have a look, see what they do, see what we can learn from him, and first try it maybe on a small scale and see what the value is. Yeah, that would be my suggestion.
Convincing politicians, knowledge transfer towards politicians, so there's immediately coming a name in my mind of a current president in the US. It will be hard. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much, Imke. It was really stimulating.
Thank you.